October 28, 1941. The air hung heavy with the acrid stench of smoke, as flames licked the wooden roofs of a small Soviet village just west of Volokholamsk, some 80 miles from the spires of Moscow. Major General Ivan Pamphilov, commander of the 316th Rifle Division, gripped the edge of a makeshift command post, a half-collapsed barn on the village outskirts, his breath visible in the freezing dusk. His face, weathered by years of service, twisted in frustration as reports flooded in. His men had abandoned Volokholamsk against direct orders from the Kremlin. This was no isolated inferno. The blaze consuming the village was deliberate, a grim tactic born of desperation. As the Wehrmacht's Army Group Center, under Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, surged forward in Operation Typhoon, launched just weeks earlier on October 2, Soviet forces enacted Stalin's scorched earth decree from July. Deny the invaders everything: food, shelter, fuel. Villages like this one, dotted along the Smolensk-Moscow highway, were torched by retreating Red Army units to leave nothing but ash for the Germans, who marched with the arrogance of conquerors expecting a swift victory. Yet the cost was human. Families fleeing with what little they could carry, their lives upended in the brutal calculus of war. Pamphilov's division rallied amid the chaos, reformed on the Volokholamsk highway that evening, digging in against the encroaching night. Criticism from higher command, Rokossovsky, his superior relaying Stalin's fury, stung like the autumn wind, but Pamphilov knew the stakes. Moscow, the heart of the Soviet Union, teetered on the brink. If it fell, the entire Eastern Front could collapse, emboldening Hitler's global ambitions. Already, since the invasion's dawn on June 22, over 3 million Axis troops had carved a path of destruction across 600 miles, encircling armies at Vyazma and Bryansk, claiming hundreds of thousands of Soviet lives. The world watched. Britain and America, newly allied against the Axis, held their breath as the fate of the war hung in the balance. But here, in the flickering glow of first light of October 29, crept over the snow-dusted fields, General Pamphilov walked the new defensive line his men had scratched into the frozen earth along the Volokholamsk highway. The village behind them still smoldered, thin columns of gray smoke rising like ghosts into the pale sky. His soldiers, wrapped in greatcoats that offered little warmth against the biting cold, worked in silence, digging trenches, positioning the precious few anti-tank guns, stacking ammunition crates pulled from burning supply dumps. Many were boys from Alma-Ata and Bishkek, Kazakh and Kyrgyz recruits who had never seen snow this deep, never heard the howl of a Stuka dive bomber until Barbarossa tore open the frontier 4 months earlier. Pamphilov stopped beside a young private whose hands bled from handling barbed wire without gloves. He said nothing, only placed a gloved hand on the boy's shoulder for a moment before moving on. That touch carried more weight than any order. Across the fields, the Germans were already stirring. Reconnaissance patrols from the 2nd Panzer Division probed forward, their gray uniforms blending with the frost. They moved with the confidence of men who had rolled from the border to here in a single, unstoppable summer. Moscow lay less than 100 miles away now, close enough that some officers joked they could smell the Kremlin's onions. But the laughter had thinned in recent weeks. The Rasputitsa, the season of mud, had bogged their vehicles for precious days, and now winter was snapping at their heels earlier than any meteorologist had dared predict. Supply lines stretched thin, fuel and winter clothing lagged far behind the spearheads. Pamphilov knew this. Intelligence reports, pieced together from intercepted radio chatter and captured dispatch riders, painted a picture of an enemy still formidable but beginning to feel the strain. Yet numbers remained brutal. Army Group Center could still field nearly 800 tanks against his division's handful of 45mm guns and improvised Molotov cocktails. Stalin's Order No. 227, not one step back, hung over every commander like a blade, but Pamphilov had already lost Volokholamsk once. He would not lose this line. By midday on the 29th, the first serious clash erupted near the village of Neladovo, just north of the highway. German infantry, supported by assault guns, pushed against the 316th's forward outposts. The fighting was close, vicious, bayonets and grenades in the birch woods. Pamphilov's men held, barely, pulling back only when ammunition ran dry. That evening, as he reviewed the casualty lists by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, one name caught his eye: Political Commissar Klochkov, a tough Moscow communist who had rallied a platoon with the words that would soon echo across the front: "Russia is vast, but there is nowhere to retreat. Moscow is behind us." The phrase was already spreading among the ranks, whispered like a prayer. The general folded the report, stared into the flame a long moment, and felt the cold settle deeper than the weather ever could. November 1941 descended like a hammer. The temperature plummeted to -20, then 30 degrees Celsius, turning the ground iron hard and the soldiers' breath into fleeting clouds. General Pamfilov's 316th Rifle Division, now officially redesignated the 8th Guards Rifle Division on November 18, in recognition of its stubborn defense, clung to the line running through the villages of Dubosakovo, Neladovo, and Petalino, barely 20 miles from the outer suburbs of Moscow. Every meter of this frozen ground had become sacred, soaked in blood and defended with a ferocity that stunned even the Germans. On the morning of November 16, the renewed German offensive struck with full force. The 11th Panzer Division, veterans of France and the Balkans, spearheaded the assault toward Krakovo, aiming to outflank Moscow from the northwest. Their objective: break through Pamfilov's sector and open the road to the capital. Opposite them stood the division's 1075th Rifle Regiment, dug in along a shallow ridge near the tiny railway halt at Dubosakovo. That afternoon, 28 men from the regiment's 4th Company, led by political instructor Vasily Klochkov, found themselves isolated at a forward anti-tank ditch. They had 4 45mm guns, a few PTRD anti-tank rifles, bundles of grenades and bottles filled with aviation fuel. Against them rolled 18 Panzer tanks of the 2nd Battalion, 11th Panzer, accompanied by motorized infantry. The fight lasted hours. Shells screamed overhead. The ground shook as tanks ground forward through snowdrifts. One by one the guns were knocked out, crews torn apart by machine gun fire. When ammunition ran low, the survivors hurled Molotovs at the steel beasts, climbing onto hulls to jam grenades into tracks. Klochkov, bandaged from an earlier wound, moved from position to position, his voice hoarse but unbroken. Russia is vast, but there is nowhere to retreat. Moscow is behind us. By dusk, the German attack had stalled. 14 tanks lay smoking or crippled in the snow. The 28 were gone, some dead, some dying, a handful captured with terrible wounds. The ridge held. News of the stand reached Pamfilov that evening in his command dugout near Shiryevo. He read the dispatch twice, then set it down without a word. The general had always been a quiet man, more comfortable listening to his soldiers than issuing grand speeches, but this report struck him like a physical blow. He stepped outside into the blinding cold, stared toward the faint glow of flares on the horizon, and lit a cigarette with fingers that barely trembled. 2 days later, on November 18, as the division received its guard's banner over field radio, a German artillery barrage walked across the headquarters area. A splinter from a 105mm shell caught Pamfilov in the temple. He died almost instantly, slumped against a frozen earth wall, the cigarette still burning between his fingers. The men of the 316th, now the 8th Guards, heard the news in stunned silence. Their father, the man who had held them together through retreat and fire, was gone. Yet the line did not break. The news of General Pamfilov's death spread through the 8th Guards Rifle Division like a frostbite that numbs before it kills. Men who had marched under his quiet command for months stood motionless in their trenches, staring at nothing as runners carried the word from dugout to dugout. No one cried out. There was no time for grief on a front where every hour brought the growl of engines and the whistle of shells. But something hardened in them that day, an unspoken vow that the ground he had died defending would not be yielded. On November 23, the Germans came again, harder than before. The 11th Panzer and the 2nd Panzer Divisions, now reinforced, threw themselves against the Dubosakovo sector in a coordinated push. Snow fell thick and relentless, turning the battlefield into a white haze broken only by muzzle flashes and burning tanks. The guardsmen fought from frozen foxholes, their rifles icing over, their fingers too numb to feel triggers. Anti-tank teams dragged their guns by hand through drifts, positioning them in the path of the oncoming steel. When the guns fell silent, the men rose with grenades and bottles, rushing the tracks in suicidal waves that somehow, impossibly, held the line. By the end of November, the German spearheads had clawed to within 18 miles of Moscow's tramlines. In some sectors, forward patrols could see the glint of the city's anti-aircraft searchlights on the horizon. Hitler, pacing the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, demanded the final breakthrough before Christmas. But the Wehrmacht was bleeding. Frostbite claimed more men than bullets in some units. Engines seized in the cold, horses, still the backbone of supply, dropped dead in their traces. The Soviets, for all their losses, had reserves flowing in from the east, Siberians in padded jackets who knew this weather as an old friend. December arrived with temperatures plunging to -40. On December 5, under cover of a blinding blizzard, Marshal Zhukov unleashed the counteroffensive he had prepared in secret for weeks. Fresh armies, the first shock, the 20th, the 16th, slammed into the exhausted German flanks north and south of Moscow. In Pamfilov's old sector, the 8th Guard surged forward alongside the 1st Guards tank brigade, retaking villages that had changed hands a dozen times. The men who had stood at Dubosakovo led the way. They moved through the same burned hamlets and frozen fields, past the blackened skeletons of tanks that still marked the November battles. No one spoke of revenge. They simply advanced, step by bitter step, pushing the invaders back from the gates they had come so close to breaching. By mid-December, the German line was bending, then cracking. The dream of a swift victory in the east, the dream that had carried Army Group Center from the border to the outskirts of Moscow, was dying in the snow. January 1942. The Red Army's counteroffensive rolled forward like a gathering storm. Villages that had burned in October now lay buried under deep snow, their charred timbers the only markers of the desperate retreat. The 8th Guards Rifle Division, carrying Pamfilov's name in their hearts even if not yet on their banners, pushed westward alongside Siberian reinforcements whose white camouflage made them ghosts in the drifts. The Germans, caught in open fields without winter gear, reeled backward in disorder. Frostbitten soldiers abandoned weapons frozen solid. Entire companies surrendered rather than face another night in the open. Panzer divisions that had once sliced through Soviet lines now limped rearward, towing crippled tanks on sledges pulled by exhausted horses. By the end of January, the front had been shoved back more than 100 miles from Moscow in places. The immediate threat to the capital was over. Stalin, from the Kremlin depths where he had refused to evacuate, allowed himself a rare moment of grim satisfaction. The city's factories resumed production. Trams rattled along streets no longer under direct artillery threat. Civilians emerged from metro stations that had served as bomb shelters for weeks. Yet victory came at a price few could fully grasp. The Battle of Moscow had consumed over 1 million Soviet lives, soldiers and civilians alike, since October. Entire divisions had vanished into German encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk. The scorched earth policy that had denied the enemy shelter had also left millions homeless in the depth of winter. And the Wehrmacht, though battered and bleeding, was far from broken. Hitler relieved von Bock and dozens of generals, vowing to hold every inch in a war now transformed into one of annihilation. In the spring of 1942, the stand at Dubosakovo entered Soviet lore. A Pravda correspondent's article immortalized the 28 men as Pamfilov's heroes, their final words, "Russia is vast, but there is nowhere to retreat," printed on posters across the Union. Statues rose, schools bore their names. The story became a cornerstone of wartime propaganda, a beacon of sacrifice that rallied a wounded nation. Later investigations would reveal complexities. The exact number of tanks destroyed, the precise dialogue, even the survival of a few of the 28 who had been captured and later escaped. But the core truth endured. In those frozen fields west of Moscow, ordinary men, recruits from distant republics, factory workers turned soldiers, had stood against the might of an invading army and refused to break. The burning village photographed on October 28, 1941, had been only one scene in a vast tragedy. From its ashes rose a defiance that helped turn the tide of the greatest land war in history. Moscow held. The road to Berlin, still years and millions of lives away, had begun. The Eastern Front would claim horrors yet unimaginable, but in the winter of 1941-42, on the approaches to the Soviet capital, the myth of German invincibility died in the snow. The photograph that began our story, a single black and white frame capturing a Soviet village wreathed in flames on October 28, 1941, survives today as one of the starkest images of the Eastern Front's early desperation. Taken by a German propaganda company photographer attached to Army Group Center, it was meant to document the rapid advance, the collapse of Soviet resistance, the inevitability of victory. Instead, it inadvertently recorded the moment when the Red Army's scorched earth policy met the civilian world head-on. Wooden homes deliberately torched to deny shelter to the invader, families fleeing into the autumn night with whatever they could carry, livestock driven ahead or slaughtered in the fields. That village, like hundreds of others along the roads to Moscow, vanished into ash and memory. No memorial marks its exact location today. The names of its inhabitants are lost to the vast anonymity of war. Yet its burning became a symbol of the price paid to stop the German juggernaut. Every structure destroyed, every harvest burned, every bridge demolished bought time, precious days that allowed Zhukov to assemble reserves, that let winter bite deeper into unprepared German bones, that gave the factories beyond the Urals time to churn out T-34 tanks by the thousands. In the decades that followed, the Soviet Union, and later Russia, honored the defenders of Moscow with parades, monuments, and eternal flames. The 8th Guards Rifle Division, Pamfilov's division, carried its banner through Stalingrad, Kursk, and on to Berlin. The 28 Pamfilov heroes became schoolbook legends, their story taught to generations as proof that courage could defy steel. Even when post-war investigations quietly acknowledged embellishments in the official account, the essence remained unchallenged. A handful of men, outgunned and outnumbered, had chosen to stand and die rather than yield ground toward the capital. The Battle of Moscow marked the first major land defeat of Hitler's Wehrmacht, shattering the aura of invincibility built in Poland, France, and the Balkans. It cost the Germans over 500,000 casualties between October and January, men they could never fully replace. It forced Hitler into a war of attrition he had never intended, drawing resources from every other theater. And it gave the Allied cause its first real glimmer of hope. If the Red Army could hold Moscow, perhaps Nazi Germany could be beaten after all. That single photograph, frozen in time, encapsulates the turning point. Flames rise against a darkening sky, silhouettes of soldiers move through the smoke, and in the distance the vast Russian horizon stretches unbroken. What looked like defeat in October became the prelude to survival. From those ashes, the long, bloody road to victory began. The legacy of that burning village and the men who defended the approaches to Moscow extends far beyond the war's end. As the conflict ground on through 1943 and 1944, the Soviet Union clawed back territory mile by mile, from the rubble of Stalingrad to the banks of the Dnieper. The 8th Guards Rifle Division, now the 8th Pamfilov Guards Rifle Division, officially renamed in 1943 to honor their fallen commander, fought in nearly every major offensive. They crossed the Oder in 1945, stormed into Berlin amid the thunder of Katyusha rockets and the chatter of submachine guns, and planted their banner on the shattered Reichstag. The division's survivors, many bearing scars from that first winter outside Moscow, stood witness to the unconditional surrender on May 9, 1945. But the human cost lingered. The Eastern Front had devoured over 20 million Soviet lives by war's end. Soldiers, partisans, civilians caught in the crossfire or starved in sieges like Leningrad. Families from those scorched villages rebuilt on the ruins, their stories passed down in whispers around kitchen tables. The night the soldiers came with torches, the long march east, the sons who never returned. In Kazakhstan, Pamfilov's homeland, monuments rose in Alma-Ata, depicting him as the stoic guardian of the motherland. His image, stern yet kind, became a fixture in textbooks, a reminder that leadership in war was as much about heart as strategy. The Germans, too, carried the scars of Moscow. The failure there reshaped the Wehrmacht. Generals purged, divisions rebuilt with conscripts and foreign volunteers, the once mighty panzer forces diluted by losses they could never recover. Hitler's obsession with the East drained men and material from Normandy and Italy, hastening the Allied victories in the West. By 1945, as American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe, the world recognized that the tide had truly turned in those frozen fields of 1941. In the Cold War years, the Battle of Moscow became a pillar of Soviet mythology, celebrated in films like The 28 Guardsmen released in 1968, which dramatized the Dubosakovo stand with heroic flair. Even as the Union collapsed in 1991, the narrative endured in Russia, invoked in speeches and parades as proof of national resilience. Today, on the highways west of Moscow, quiet memorials dot the landscape where villages once burned. Tourists pause at Dubosakovo's granite obelisk, etched with names of the fallen, while the wind whispers through the birch trees. The photograph from October 28, 1941, resides in archives, a silent witness to the moment when desperation forged defiance. 80 years later, the echoes of that October fire still resonate in a world shaped by the war's aftermath. The Soviet victory at Moscow not only saved a city but redefined the global order. It forged the uneasy alliance that crushed the Axis, Red Army tanks rolling into Berlin alongside American bombers pounding the Ruhr. Without that stand in the snow, the D-Day landings might have faced a Wehrmacht unbroken by the East, and the atomic age might have dawned over a different map. In modern Russia, the Pamfilov heroes endure as icons of patriotism. Films and documentaries revisit Dubosakovo, blending fact with legend to inspire new generations amid fresh conflicts. Veterans' reunions, dwindling now, gather at the memorials where old men with medals pinned to faded uniforms recount the cold, the fear, the unbreakable will. One survivor, long after the war, described the burning villages as the price of tomorrow. Homes lost so that children could one day rebuild. Yet the story also serves as a caution. The scorched earth tactics that halted the Germans left scars on the land and its people, a reminder that war's necessities breed their own tragedies. In Ukraine and Belarus, where much of the front lay, descendants sift through archives for names of the forgotten, piecing together lives interrupted by flame and invasion. The photograph itself, digitized and shared online, draws viewers into that distant autumn. It captures not just destruction but the human spirit's refusal to yield. From a single village set ablaze on October 28, 1941, amid the chaos of retreat, emerged the resolve that helped bend history's arc. In the end, it was ordinary people, soldiers like those 28, commanders like Panfilov, villagers fleeing the smoke, who turned the tide. Their sacrifice whispers across time. In the face of overwhelming darkness, even ashes can fuel the light.